I still remember the night the lie was born. I remember the way the candlelight flickered against the mahogany walls of the drawing room, casting shadows that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. And I remember the taste of fear on my tongue, metallic and cold. It was the autumn of 1842, and I had been residing at Ashford Hall for nearly 3 years as a companion to the late Duchess, a position that afforded me comfort and respectability, but left me always hovering at the edge of belonging. The Duchess had passed that spring, and I remained at the estate by the grace of the Duke, Edward Ashford, a man whose stern countenance and rigid adherence to duty made him both respected and feared throughout the county. He was a figure carved from stone, it seemed, all sharp angles and unsmiling lips, and I had learned to move through the house like a ghost, present but unnoticed, useful but unobtrusive. That night, the house was alive with tension. The Duke had summoned his younger brother, William, to his study, and the entire household held its breath. William was everything Edward was not. Where the Duke was cold and unyielding, William was warm and careless, his laughter ringing through the halls like music, his presence a kind of sunlight that made even the servants smile. He was 7 years younger than his brother, still unmarried, still free in the way that second sons sometimes are, unburdened by the weight of title and expectation. I had watched him from a distance, as one watches a flame, drawn to the light but afraid of the burn. The accusation had come from Lady Catherine Montrose, a widow of considerable fortune and even greater ambition, who had been a guest at the estate for the past fortnight. She claimed that a valuable necklace, a family heirloom of emeralds and diamonds, had been taken from her chamber, and she had seen William leaving the corridor near her rooms late one evening. Her words were delivered with tears and trembling hands, and the Duke, ever the protector of propriety and reputation, had taken her claims with the gravity they seemed to deserve. I knew the truth, though I told myself I did not. I had been walking the upper hallway that same evening, unable to sleep, my mind restless with thoughts I dared not name. I had seen Lady Catherine herself slip into the music room with the necklace in her hands, and I had seen her hide it behind the loose panel near the pianoforte, the same panel where old letters and forgotten trinkets were sometimes concealed. I had watched her arrange her hair, smooth her gown, and then hurry back toward her chambers with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to deception. But I said nothing. Fear sealed my lips as surely as any lock. Lady Catherine had power, connections, the ear of the Duke himself. I was nobody, a woman of modest birth who depended entirely on the goodwill of this household for my survival. To accuse her would be to invite ruin, to cast myself out into a world that had no place for women without family or fortune. And so I retreated to my room, pulled the covers over my head, and prayed that the matter would resolve itself without my involvement. It did not. The Duke confronted William in his study that night, and I heard the raised voices even from my chamber 2 floors above. William's protests, his shock and anger, his insistence that he was innocent, all of it crashed against the immovable wall of Edward's judgment. The Duke demanded that William confess, that he return the necklace and beg forgiveness, and when William refused, when he stood firm in his denial, Edward's voice turned to ice. I crept down the stairs, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. I told myself I would speak, that I would tell the Duke what I had seen. But when I reached the doorway of the study, I saw the look on Edward's face, the terrible certainty in his eyes, and my courage failed me. He had already made his decision. William was guilty in his mind, guilty of recklessness, of dishonor, of bringing shame upon the family name. The Duke would not hear reason, would not entertain doubt. He was judge and executioner both, and his word was final. William was banished that very night. He was given 1 hour to pack his belongings, forbidden from ever setting foot on Ashford land again, cut off from the family fortune, stripped of his name and his place in society. I watched from the shadows as he descended the grand staircase, his face pale but defiant, his jaw set in a line that reminded me achingly of his brother. He carried a single trunk, and he did not look back. Edward stood in the entrance hall, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression carved from granite. He said nothing as William walked out into the night, and he said nothing when the door closed behind him with a finality that echoed through the house like a gunshot. Lady Catherine stood beside the Duke, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her eyes dry now, her mouth curved in the faintest hint of satisfaction. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run after William, to tell him that I knew the truth, that he was innocent, that he had been wronged in the most monstrous way. But I did nothing. I stood frozen in the corridor, my nails digging into my palms. My breath caught in my chest, and I let him go. I let him walk out into the darkness, alone and disgraced, and I told myself it was not my place to interfere, that I had no choice, that my silence was a matter of survival. The necklace was found 3 days later, exactly where I had seen Lady Catherine hide it. A housemaid, dusting the music room, discovered it behind the loose panel and brought it to the Duke in a state of great confusion. Lady Catherine claimed she must have misplaced it herself, that the strain of recent events had confused her memory, and she apologized profusely for the misunderstanding. The Duke accepted her apology with a tight nod, and the matter was closed. No one spoke of William. No one suggested that he be recalled, that the banishment be lifted, that amends be made. The household simply moved forward, as if William had never existed, as if the injustice had never occurred. But I could not move forward. Guilt wrapped around me like chains, heavy and unyielding, and I carried it with me through every day that followed. I saw William's face in every shadow, heard his voice in every creak of the floorboards. I wrote letters to him, dozens of them, pouring out my confession and my shame, but I never sent them. I did not know where he had gone, and even if I had, I could not imagine that my words would bring him any comfort. What good would it do to tell him that I had known the truth and said nothing? What purpose would it serve except to ease my own conscience at the cost of his pain? Years passed, slow and grey as winter fog. Lady Catherine married a baronet and left Ashford Hall, and I remained, a fixture in the house, aging quietly in the service of a family that barely noticed me. The Duke grew older, harder, more distant. He never married, never spoke of his brother, never showed a moment of regret or doubt. He ruled his estate with the same iron discipline, and the household ran smoothly under his command, a well-oiled machine devoid of warmth or laughter. I became a creature of routine, my days measured in small tasks and quiet hours. I managed the household accounts, supervised the servants, read to myself by the fire in the evenings. I attended church on Sundays and walked the grounds when the weather permitted, always alone, always lost in thoughts of what might have been. I grew thin and pale, my hair turning silver before its time, my hands becoming gnarled with the cold that seemed to seep into my bones no matter how high the fires were built. And then, in the spring of 1857, the Duke fell ill. It began as a cough, persistent and rattling, and within weeks he was confined to his bed, his face gaunt, his breathing labored. The doctors came and went, shaking their heads, prescribing tonics and bleedings that did nothing to slow the disease consuming him from within. The household moved through the days in a kind of hushed dread, waiting for the inevitable. I sat with him often, reading aloud from books he did not hear, arranging his pillows, bringing him water he could not swallow. He rarely spoke, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his mind somewhere far away. But one evening, as the sun set and the room filled with golden light, he turned his head toward me and said my name, Eleanor. His voice was a rasp, barely audible, but it startled me so much that I nearly dropped the book in my hands. He had not addressed me directly in years, had not acknowledged my presence except as one acknowledges a piece of furniture. I set the book aside and leaned closer, my heart beginning to pound. He was looking at me now, truly looking, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. regret. It was there in the lines of his face, in the tremor of his hands, in the way his lips pressed together as if holding back words that demanded to be spoken. "I wronged him," he said, and the words fell between us like stones. "William, I wronged him." I could not speak. My throat closed, my eyes burned, and I could only sit there, frozen, as the Duke's confession spilled out in broken fragments. He told me that he had known, even then, that something was amiss. He had known that William was not capable of such deceit, that Lady Catherine's accusations were convenient and her distress performative. But he had been so consumed with preserving the family's reputation, so determined to maintain control, that he had chosen certainty over truth. He had chosen to believe the lie because it was easier than admitting he had been deceived. And now, as death drew near, the weight of that choice crushed him. He wanted to see William again, to beg his forgiveness, to tell him that he had been wrong. He asked me, with tears in his eyes, if I knew where his brother might be found, if there was any way to reach him before it was too late. I did not know. I had no answer to give him. But in that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I would find William Ashford, no matter how long it took, no matter how far I had to go. I would bring him home, and I would tell him the truth, the whole truth, including my own part in his suffering. I owed him that much. I owed them both that much. The Duke died 3 days later, his last words a whispered plea for his brother's forgiveness. And I, who had been silent for so long, finally found my voice. The search for William Ashford began with fragments and whispers, the kind of information that surfaces only when one knows how to ask and whom to trust. I started with the household staff, those who had served at Ashford Hall long enough to remember William before his banishment, before his name became a silence that no one dared to break. Mrs. Dawson, the housekeeper who had been with the family since before I arrived, was my first ally, though she was cautious in her assistance, fearful of speaking too openly about matters the Duke had commanded be forgotten. She told me that William had gone to London first. That much she knew from a letter he had sent to one of the stable boys, a young man named Thomas, who had been fond of him. The letter had arrived months after the banishment, brief and carefully worded, mentioning lodgings near Cheapside and work as a clerk in a shipping office. Thomas had kept the letter hidden, afraid that showing it to anyone might bring trouble. But after the Duke's death, he brought it to me with trembling hands, as if offering a relic of great and dangerous value. I held that letter in my hands for a long time, staring at William's handwriting, the neat script that seemed almost defiant in its ordinariness, as if he were determined to prove that exile had not broken him. There was no return address, no indication of where he might be now, years later. But it was a beginning. It was more than I had dared to hope for. The estate fell into the hands of a distant cousin, a man named Mr. Reginald Ashford, who arrived from Surrey with his wife and 3 children, eager to claim his inheritance. He was a practical man, uninterested in the history of the house or the sins of his predecessors, and he made it clear that the household would be reorganized, that certain economies would need to be made. I understood what that meant. My position, already tenuous, would soon be dissolved entirely. I had perhaps 3 months before I would be turned out, given a modest reference and a smaller sum of money, and sent away to find my own path in a world that had little use for aging spinsters without connections. I did not wait for that humiliation. I gave my notice, citing personal reasons, and I left Ashford Hall on a gray morning in early June, carrying a single trunk and a leather satchel containing the few items of value I possessed. Mrs. Dawson wept as she embraced me at the door. Pressing a small purse of coins into my hands, money she insisted I take, though I knew she could ill afford to part with it. Thomas drove me to the village station in the cart, and as I watched Ashford Hall disappear behind the hills, I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief, as if I were shedding a skin that had long since grown too tight. London overwhelmed me, I had been to the city only twice before, both times in the company of the late Duchess, and I had never ventured into the streets alone, never navigated the noise and the crowds and the relentless press of humanity that filled every corner. I took lodgings in a respectable boarding house near Russell Square, a narrow building with creaking floors and thin walls, run by a widow named Mrs. Pelham, who asked few questions and expected her tenants to keep to themselves. I began my search methodically, visiting shipping offices throughout the city, inquiring after a clerk named William Ashford, who might have worked there 15 years prior. Most of the clerks I spoke with were young men who had no memory of anyone by that name, and the older men were wary of my questions, suspicious of a woman asking after a man without proper explanation. I learned to soften my inquiries, to invent a story about a lost cousin, a family inheritance that needed to be settled, anything that might make my search seem respectable rather than desperate. Weeks passed, and I found nothing. The city swallowed my efforts as easily as it swallowed everything else, indifferent to my purpose, unmoved by my determination. I walked until my feet bled, knocked on doors until my knuckles were bruised, and each night I returned to my small room exhausted and empty-handed, the weight of my failure pressing down on me like a physical thing. It was in late July, during a particularly oppressive heat wave, that I finally found a thread to pull. A clerk at a shipping office near the docks, an older man with kind eyes and a patient manner, remembered a William Ashford who had worked there briefly, more than a decade ago. He had been competent, the clerk said, quiet and hard-working, but he had left after only a year, saying he had found a position elsewhere. The clerk thought he had mentioned going north, perhaps to Yorkshire or Durham, but he could not be certain. It was so long ago, and so many young men had passed through that office seeking their fortunes. North. It was not much, but it was more than I had before. I thanked the clerk profusely, and I left the office with my heart pounding, my mind already racing ahead, planning the next stage of my journey. But as I walked back toward my lodgings, winding through the narrow streets crowded with vendors and carriages, I felt a sudden prickle of awareness, the sensation of being watched. I turned, scanning the crowd, and for just a moment I thought I saw a figure standing in the shadows of a doorway, tall and still, his face obscured by the brim of a dark hat. My breath caught, my pulse quickened, and I took a step toward him, but a cart rolled past, blocking my view, and when it had gone, the doorway was empty. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, the product of too many sleepless nights and too much strain. But the feeling lingered, uneasy and persistent, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder all the way home. That night, I made my decision. I would go north to Yorkshire, and I would continue my search there. I had enough money to sustain myself for a few more months, if I was careful, and if I found nothing by then, well, I would face that reality when it came. I could not return to the life I had left behind, could not go back to being the silent, invisible woman who had allowed an innocent man to suffer. I had to see this through, no matter the cost. I booked passage on a coach heading to York, and I departed 3 days later, just as dawn was breaking over the city. The journey took 2 days, the coach rattling along rutted roads, stopping at inns where I slept fitfully in shared rooms with other travelers. The countryside rolled past the windows, green and expansive, so different from the close, suffocating streets of London, and I felt something in my chest begin to loosen, as if the air itself were easier to breathe. York was smaller than London, but no less bustling, its medieval walls and narrow lanes filled with merchants and travelers and the constant hum of commerce. I found lodgings at an inn called the White Swan, a respectable establishment near the Minster, and I set about my search once more, this time visiting churches and parish registers, hoping that William might have settled somewhere nearby, that his name might appear in some record or ledger. It was a vicar at a small church on the outskirts of the city who finally gave me the information I sought. He was an elderly man, stooped and white-haired, and he listened to my inquiries with a thoughtful expression, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. After a long pause, He told me that he did indeed remember a William Ashford, a gentleman who had come to the parish some years ago, quietly and without fanfare. He had purchased a small property in the village of Helmsley, about 25 miles to the north, and he had lived there alone, keeping to himself, rarely venturing into society. The vicar's words sent a jolt through me, a mixture of hope and fear so intense I could barely speak. I asked if William was still there, if the vicar knew whether he was well, but the old man shook his head slowly. He had not seen William in more than a year, he said, and he had heard rumors that the property had been sold, that William had moved on, perhaps to Scotland or even abroad, but he could not say for certain. The parish records might have more information, he suggested, if I cared to examine them. I spent the rest of that day poring over dusty ledgers in the dim light of the church office, my eyes straining to read the faded ink, my heart sinking with each page that yielded nothing. But then, near the end of the final ledger, I found it, a record of sale dated 18 months prior, transferring ownership of a property in Helmsley from William J. Ashford to a Mr. and Mrs. Edward Thornton. And beneath it, in smaller script, a forwarding address, written in the vicar's hand as a courtesy, I supposed, in case any correspondence should arrive. The address was in a village called Ravenscroft, in the Lake District, more than 100 miles to the northwest. It was remote, isolated, the kind of place one went to disappear, to escape the world and all its judgments. My hands shook as I copied the address into my notebook, and I thanked the vicar with a voice that trembled despite my efforts to steady it. I left York the following morning, taking a series of coaches and hired carts that carried me deeper into the wild northern landscape, through valleys and over hills, past stone walls and grazing sheep and villages so small they seemed barely more than clusters of cottages. The journey took nearly a week, the roads growing rougher and the accommodations more primitive the farther I traveled. But I did not care. I was close now, so close I could feel it in the tightness of my chest, in the way my breath quickened every time I asked for directions and received a nod of recognition. Ravenscroft was a tiny hamlet nestled at the edge of a lake, surrounded by fells that rose dark and imposing against the sky. There was an inn, a church, a scattering of houses, and little else. The innkeeper, a stout woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner, confirmed that a Mr. Ashford lived nearby in a cottage about a mile up the fell road past the old shepherd's hut. He kept to himself, she said, came into the village only rarely for supplies or the occasional letter. He was polite but distant, a man who clearly wished to be left alone. I did not ask her anything more. I thanked her, took a room for the night, and the next morning I set out on foot, following the narrow road that wound up into the hills. The air was cool and fresh, scented with heather and damp earth, and the only sounds were the bleating of distant sheep and the cry of birds overhead. My heart hammered in my chest, and with every step I took, I rehearsed what I would say, how I would explain myself, how I would ask for forgiveness I had no right to expect. The cottage appeared suddenly, tucked into a hollow between two slopes, its stone walls weathered and its roof covered in moss. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin line against the gray sky, and I could see a small garden beside the house, rows of vegetables and herbs growing in neat lines. I stopped at the gate, my hand resting on the wooden post, my courage threatening to fail me. And then the door opened, and a man stepped out, tall and lean, his dark hair streaked with gray, his face lined with years I had not been there to witness. He saw me standing there, and he froze, his eyes widening, his expression shifting from surprise to something I could not name. It was William. After 15 years, after all the miles and all the searching, I had found him. And now, standing before him with the weight of my confession pressing down on me like a stone, I realized that finding him had been the easy part. Speaking the truth, facing the consequences of my silence, that would be the hardest thing I had ever done. He did not speak, did not move, and neither did I. We simply stood there, separated by the width of a garden path. Two people bound by a history of pain and betrayal, and I wondered if either of us would have the courage to cross that distance. William spoke first, his voice rougher than I remembered, shaped by years of solitude and whatever hardships he had endured. He said my name, just my name, and it sounded both like a question and an accusation, as if he could not quite believe I was real, as if my presence here was some trick of memory or madness. I tried to speak, to offer some explanation for my sudden appearance, but the words tangled in my throat, and all I could manage was a broken sound that might have been the beginning of an apology or simply a sob. He stepped forward then, crossing the garden path with slow, deliberate movements, and when he stood before me, close enough that I could see the lines around his eyes and the silver in his hair, I felt the full weight of what I had come to do pressing down on me until I thought I might collapse beneath it. He did not touch me, did not offer any gesture of welcome or comfort. He simply looked at me with those gray eyes that had once been so quick to light with laughter, and I saw in them a wariness that cut deeper than any anger could have. He had learned not to trust, I realized. The world had taught him that lesson thoroughly, and I had been one of his teachers. "Why are you here?" he asked, and the question was so direct, so devoid of pleasantries or pretense, that it startled me into honesty. "Your brother is dead," I said, and I watched the words land, watched his face close and harden, watched him take a half step back as if I had struck him. "He died 3 months ago. His last wish was to see you, to beg your forgiveness. I have come to tell you what he could not." William turned away from me then, his shoulders rigid, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He stood like that for a long moment, so still he might have been carved from the same stone as the cottage walls, and I did not dare interrupt his silence. The wind moved through the heather, carrying with it the scent of rain, and somewhere in the distance a lamb called for its mother. When he finally spoke again, his voice was flat, stripped of emotion. "I have nothing to forgive him for. He made his choice 15 years ago. It no longer matters." But the words were hollow, and we both knew it. I could hear the grief beneath them, the anger and the pain that had not diminished with time, but had only settled deeper, calcified into something harder and more enduring than bone. He had not forgiven Edward. He had simply learned to live with the weight of that unforgiveness, to carry it the way one carries a scar, visible or hidden, but always present. "There is more," I said, forcing myself to continue, to push past my fear and my shame. "There is something you must know, something I should have told you 15 years ago. The necklace, the accusation, it was all a lie. Lady Catherine hid the necklace herself. I saw her do it. I watched her place it behind the panel in the music room, and I said nothing. I let you be banished for a crime you did not commit, and I have carried that silence like a stone ever since." He turned back to me slowly, and the look on his face was one I will never forget. It was not anger, not the explosion of rage I might have expected and perhaps even deserved. It was something far worse. It was comprehension, the terrible understanding of what my words meant, the realization that his suffering had not been the result of misfortune or misunderstanding, but of deliberate cowardice, of a choice I had made to protect myself at his expense. "You knew," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "You knew, and you let me go." I could not hold his gaze. I looked down at my hands, at the worn gloves I had mended so many times the stitches showed like scars, and I felt the truth of my guilt settle over me like a shroud. "Yes," I said, "I knew, and I did nothing. I was afraid. I was a coward. And I have spent every day since then wishing I could undo that choice, knowing I never can." The silence that followed was vast and terrible. I heard him breathing, harsh and uneven, and I heard the wind in the grass and the distant cry of a hawk, and I thought perhaps this was the moment he would tell me to leave, to take my confession and my guilt, and go back to whatever life I had left, to never speak to him again. And I would have gone. I would have accepted that judgment as fair and just, because what else could I do? But he did not send me away. Instead, he said, in a voice so quiet I almost did not hear it, "Come inside. You look half frozen, and we cannot talk out here like this." The cottage was small and spare, a single main room with a fireplace at one end and a narrow staircase leading to what I assumed was a sleeping loft above. There was a table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with books, and a desk near the window covered with papers and ink. It was the home of a man who lived alone and had made peace with that solitude, a space functional and unadorned, lacking the softness or warmth that a woman's presence might have added. William gestured for me to sit, and I lowered myself into one of the chairs, my legs trembling with exhaustion and relief and fear all tangled together. He moved to the fireplace, added wood to the dying embers, coaxed the flames back to life with practiced efficiency. Then he filled a kettle from a bucket near the door and hung it over the fire, and all of this he did in silence, his movements deliberate and controlled, as if keeping his hands busy was the only way to keep himself from saying something he might regret. When the tea was ready, he poured 2 cups and set one before me, then sat down across the table, his hands wrapped around his own cup, but not drinking. We sat like that for a time, the steam rising between us, the fire crackling softly, and I searched for words that might bridge the chasm between us, knowing that no words could ever be enough. "Tell me everything," he said at last. "From the beginning. I want to know exactly what happened, and I want to know why you have come here now, after all this time." And so I told him. I told him about Lady Catherine, about what I had seen that night, about my fear and my silence and the years that followed. I told him about Edward's illness, about his deathbed confession, about his desperate wish to see William again, to beg his forgiveness before he died. I told him about my search, about the months of traveling and asking and following threads of information until they led me here. And I told him, though it shamed me to say it, that I had come not only to deliver Edward's message, but to seek some measure of redemption for myself, to unburden my conscience even though I knew I had no right to ask for his understanding or his forgiveness. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder. When I finished, when there was nothing left to confess, he was silent for a long time, and I sat there in that silence, feeling the weight of it, the space where judgment or mercy might appear but had not yet taken shape. Finally, he spoke, and his words were measured, careful, as if he were testing each one before allowing it into the air. "You were afraid. I understand that. Fear is a powerful thing, and you had no reason to risk yourself for me. We were not friends. We barely knew each other. You owed me nothing." "But I did," I said, my voice breaking. "I owed you the truth. I owed you what any decent person owes another. I owed you honesty, and I failed to give it." He shook his head slowly. "You owed me nothing," he repeated. "But you have come here now, and you have told me the truth, and that took a different kind of courage. I will not pretend that I am not angry. I am. I am angry at you, and I am angry at Edward. And I am angry at a world that values reputation over justice. But I am also tired, Eleanor. I am tired of carrying this weight, tired of letting the past consume me. My brother is dead, and he died with regret, and perhaps that is punishment enough. His words should have brought me comfort, but they did not. There was no absolution in them, no easy forgiveness that would erase my guilt and allow me to walk away with a lighter heart. He was offering me something more complicated, more honest. He was offering me the truth of his pain and the acknowledgement that forgiveness, if it came at all, would be a long and difficult process, not a single moment of grace. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Will you return to London? To Ashford Hall?" "I have nowhere to return to," I said. "The estate has passed to a cousin. I have no position, no family, no place in the world that I can call my own. I came here with the last of my money and the last of my hope, and I do not know what comes next." He studied me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression, a softening around the edges, a flicker of something that might have been compassion or simply weariness. "You cannot stay here," he said, and my heart sank, but then he continued. "The cottage is too small, and it would not be proper. But there is a widow in the village, Mrs. Hartley, who takes in lodgers. She is a kind woman and her rates are fair. You could stay there for a time until you decide what you want to do." "Why would you help me?" I asked, and the question came out sharper than I intended, edged with disbelief and self-recrimination. "After what I have done, why would you offer me anything?" "Because," he said, and his voice was gentler now, almost sad. "Because I have spent 15 years hating the people who wronged me, and I have learned that hate is a heavy thing to carry. I do not wish to carry it any more. And because, despite everything, I believe you when you say you are sorry. I believe you have suffered too in your own way, and I do not wish to add to that suffering if I can help it." Tears spilled down my cheeks then, hot and unchecked, and I did not try to stop them. I wept for William, for Edward, for the years lost and the damage done, and I wept for myself, for the woman I had been and the woman I was trying to become. William did not try to comfort me, did not offer empty words or false reassurances. He simply sat across from me, holding his tea, letting me cry until the tears ran dry and I was left hollow and exhausted. When I could speak again, I thanked him, my voice hoarse and broken. I thanked him for his kindness, for not sending me away, for giving me a chance I did not deserve. And I promised him, with every ounce of sincerity I possessed, that I would do whatever I could to make amends, to prove that his mercy had not been misplaced. He nodded, and though there was no smile on his face, there was a softness in his eyes that had not been there before. "We will see," he said. "We will see what the future holds." I stayed in Ravenscroft, taking a room at Mrs. Hartley's house, a tidy cottage with lace curtains and a garden full of roses. The widow was indeed kind, a plump woman in her 60s with a ready laugh and a talent for making one feel welcome without prying into one's affairs. She asked no questions about why I had come to the village or how long I intended to stay, and I was grateful for her discretion. William and I fell into a cautious rhythm. We did not see each other every day, but when we did, it was with a tentative politeness, as if we were learning how to be in each other's presence without the weight of the past crushing us. He showed me the fells, the paths he walked each morning, the places where wild thyme grew and the view stretched out for miles. I told him about my years at Ashford Hall, about the Duchess and the household, and the small kindnesses that had made that life bearable. Slowly, carefully, we began to build something new, something fragile, but real. It was not friendship, not yet, and it was certainly not forgiveness, not in any complete sense. But it was a beginning, a tentative bridge across the divide, and that was more than I had dared to hope for when I first set out on this journey. And yet, even as the days passed and the distance between us began to close, I could not shake the feeling that there was still something unspoken between us, some truth or fear or longing that neither of us was ready to name. Autumn arrived early in the Lake District that year, painting the fells in shades of amber and rust, bringing with it cold winds and the smell of peat smoke from cottage chimneys. I had been in Ravenscroft for nearly 3 months, and in that time something had shifted between William and me, though I could not have named it precisely. The wariness had not disappeared entirely, but it had softened, giving way to something gentler, more forgiving, and far more dangerous to my guarded heart. We had fallen into a pattern of companionship that felt almost natural, as if we had always known each other this way. He would come to Mrs. Hartley's cottage in the mornings, sometimes bringing fresh eggs from a neighbor's hens or apples from the trees that grew wild on the hillside. We would walk together, following the paths that wound through the valleys and up onto the ridges where the wind blew fierce and cold and the world seemed to stretch on forever. He spoke of his years in exile, though never bitterly, and I listened, grateful for his willingness to share that part of himself with me. He had been many things in those 15 years. A clerk, as I had learned, but also a tutor, a bookkeeper, a laborer on the docks when money grew scarce and pride had to be set aside. He had lived in rooms so small and cold he could see his breath in the mornings, had gone days without proper meals, had learned what it meant to be invisible in a world that had once acknowledged him as a gentleman. But he had also found a kind of freedom in that anonymity, he said. No one in those places knew or cared who his family was, what scandal had driven him away. He was simply William, a man who worked and paid his rent and kept to himself, and there was a strange peace in that. I told him about my own years, though they seemed pale and uneventful by comparison. I spoke of the monotony of life at Ashford Hall after he left, the way the house had felt like a tomb, grand and silent and empty of warmth. I told him about the guilt that had haunted me, the nights I could not sleep, the letters I had written and never sent. And I told him, though it shamed me, about how small my life had been, how narrow, how I had allowed fear to dictate every choice until I had become little more than a shadow, existing but not truly living. He listened without judgment, and when I finished, he said something that surprised me. "You are braver than you think, Eleanor. It takes courage to face the past, to seek out the person you have wronged and speak the truth. Most people never do that. They carry their guilt to the grave, and they tell themselves it is too late to make amends. You did not do that. You are here." His words warmed me more than I wanted to admit, and I found myself seeking his company more often, finding excuses to walk past his cottage or to linger in the village on days when I knew he would be there. Mrs. Hartley noticed, of course, though she said nothing directly. She simply smiled knowingly when I mentioned William's name, and once, as I was leaving to meet him for a walk, she patted my hand and said, "He is a good man, my dear. A lonely one, I think, but good. You could do far worse." I did not know how to respond to that, so I said nothing, but her words stayed with me, circling in my mind like birds that would not settle. Was I seeking his forgiveness, or was I seeking something else, something I had not allowed myself to name or even acknowledge? I did not know. I knew only that I felt more alive in his presence than I had felt in years, that the sound of his voice and the sight of his rare, hesitant smile made something in my chest ache in a way that was both painful and sweet. One afternoon in late October, as we walked along the edge of the lake, the water dark and still beneath a gray sky, William stopped suddenly and turned to face me. His expression was serious, almost troubled, and my heart quickened with a sudden fear that he was about to tell me he wanted me to leave, that I had overstayed whatever welcome he had offered. But instead, he said, "There is something I need to tell you. Something I should have said sooner, but I did not know how, or if I even should." I waited, my breath caught in my throat, my hands clenched inside my cloak. When I left Ashford Hall, he continued, when I was banished and cast out, I told myself that I would forget everything and everyone connected to that place. I would make a new life, and I would never look back. And for a long time, I succeeded. I did not think about my brother, or the estate, or the life I had lost. But there was one thing I could not forget, no matter how hard I tried. He paused, and the silence stretched between us, taut and fragile. "I could not forget you," he said, and the words fell into the space between us like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that I felt in every part of my being. "I barely knew you then? We had spoken perhaps a dozen times, always in passing, always with the formality that the household required. But I noticed you. I noticed the way you moved through the rooms like a ghost, quiet and careful, as if you were afraid to take up too much space. I noticed the sadness in your eyes, even when you smiled. And I wondered about you, about what had brought you to Ashford Hall, about what you were running from or hiding from. I told myself it was foolish, that I had no right to wonder, that you were beyond my reach in every way that mattered. But I could not stop. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he must be able to hear it. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came, and he continued, his voice low and raw with honesty. When I learned that you had seen what happened that night, that you had known the truth and said nothing, I was angry. I will not lie to you about that. I was furious, and I hated you for a time, as I hated everyone else who had played a part in my ruin. But even then, even in my anger, I could not forget you. And when you came here, when you stood at my gate and told me the truth, I realized that you had carried your own prison all these years, just as I had carried mine. And I wondered, Eleanor, I wondered if perhaps we might both be ready to lay those burdens down. I did not realize I was crying until I felt the tears on my cheeks, cold in the autumn air. I had not allowed myself to imagine that he might feel anything for me beyond tolerance or pity, had not dared to hope that the growing warmth between us might be more than simple companionship. But here he was, offering me not only forgiveness, but something far more precious, something I had thought lost to me forever. I do not deserve your regard, I said, my voice shaking. I do not deserve your kindness, and I certainly do not deserve anything more. He stepped closer, and I could see the intensity in his eyes, the vulnerability there that he was choosing to show me despite the risk. Perhaps not, he said, but I am offering it anyway, not because you have earned it, but because I am tired of living half a life. I am tired of being alone, of punishing myself and everyone else for the sins of the past. I am telling you this because I want you to stay, Eleanor. Not out of obligation or guilt, but because you choose to, because you want to. And do you, he asked, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper, do you want to stay? The question hung in the air between us, and I knew that my answer would change everything, that there would be no going back once the words were spoken. I could leave, could return to London or find some other place to disappear into, could spend the rest of my life alone and safe and untouched by the risk of this kind of intimacy. Or I could stay, could step forward into this fragile, tentative thing that was forming between us, could allow myself to hope for something I had long since stopped believing was possible. Yes, I said. And the word came out steady and sure, surprising me with its certainty. Yes, I want to stay. He smiled then, a real smile, the first I had seen from him, and it transformed his face, erasing years of hardship and sorrow and leaving behind the man he might have been if the world had been kinder. He reached for my hand, and I let him take it, his fingers warm and strong around mine. And we stood there by the water's edge as the wind moved through the grass and the sky darkened overhead, and I felt something inside me shift and settle, like a door closing on the past and another one opening onto a future I had not imagined. The days that followed were the happiest I had known in more years than I could count. William and I spent every moment we could together, walking the fells, sitting by his fire, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other in the way that people do when they are no longer hiding behind walls of caution and fear. He showed me the books he loved, read passages aloud in his clear, measured voice, and I told him stories of the Duchess, of her wit and kindness, of the small rebellions she had staged against the strictures of her position. Mrs. Hartley watched all of this with a pleased expression, and one evening, as I sat in her parlor mending a shawl, she said, "You are good for him, you know. He has been here 3 years, and I have never seen him smile the way he does when you are near. Whatever happened between you in the past, it is clear you have both found a way to move beyond it." "I hope so," I said, and I meant it with all my heart. But even in those bright, warm days, there was a shadow that I could not quite shake, a sense of something unfinished, some obstacle that had not yet been named. William felt it too, I think, because sometimes I would catch him looking at me with a troubled expression, as if he were wrestling with some question he was not yet ready to ask. The answer came one cold November evening, when we sat together in his cottage, the fire burning low, the darkness pressing close against the windows. He had been quiet all evening, his gaze distant, and finally I asked him what troubled him, if there was something I could do to ease whatever burden he carried. He was silent for a long moment, and then he said, "There is something you should know, Eleanor. Something I have not told you, because I was afraid it would change the way you see me, the way you see this, whatever this is between us." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Tell me," I said. "I am not the man I was before the banishment," he said slowly. "I am not a gentleman anymore, not in any way that matters. I have no title, no fortune, no place in society. I have this cottage and a small income from investments I made years ago, and that is all. If you stay with me, if this continues, you will be tying yourself to a man who has nothing to offer you but a simple, quiet life in a place most of the world has forgotten. You will have no position, no security, nothing but what we can build together. And I need to know that you understand that you are choosing this with full knowledge of what it means." I looked at him, at the lines of worry etched into his face, at the way his hands gripped the arms of his chair as if bracing for a blow, and I felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed me. He thought I cared about titles or fortunes or position. He thought I had come all this way, confessed all that I had confessed, opened my heart in all the ways I had opened it, only to turn away now, because he could not offer me the trappings of a life I had never wanted in the first place. I reached across the space between us and took his hand, holding it tightly, willing him to hear the truth in my words. "I do not want a life of grand houses and social position, William. I have had that life, or at least the shadow of it, and it brought me nothing but loneliness and regret. I want a life where I am seen, where I am known, where I am allowed to be myself without fear or pretense. I want a life with you, if you will have me, and I do not care if that life is lived in a cottage on a fell or in a palace. All that matters is that we are together, and that we are honest with each other, and that we do not let the past steal whatever future we might have." He stared at me for a long moment, and then he pulled me toward him, wrapping his arms around me and holding me close, and I felt the tension drain out of him, felt him breathe deeply, as if he had been holding his breath for a very long time and could finally let it go. We were married in the small church in Ravenscroft on a morning in early December, with Mrs. Hartley and the vicar as our only witnesses. There were no grand celebrations, no elaborate gowns or formal announcements. Nothing to mark the occasion except the words we spoke to each other, and the simple gold band William slipped onto my finger. It was the ring his mother had worn, he told me, one of the few things he had taken with him when he left Ashford Hall, kept all these years in a wooden box at the bottom of his trunk. I wore a dress of deep blue wool, practical and warm, and I carried a small bouquet of dried heather that Mrs. Hartley had pressed for me, tied with a ribbon she had saved from her own wedding 40 years before. The ceremony was brief and solemn, and when it was over, when the vicar pronounced us husband and wife, William kissed me gently, and I felt something in my chest unfurl like a flower that had been closed for too long, finally opening to the light. We walked back to the cottage together, hand in hand, through lanes dusted with frost, and I thought about all the years that had led to this moment, all the pain and regret and guilt that had brought me here. It seemed impossible that something so good could have grown from such bitter soil, and yet here we were, bound together not by obligation or convenience, but by choice, by the stubborn determination to build something new from the ruins of the past. The winter that followed was cold and hard, but inside the cottage there was warmth. We settled into the rhythms of married life with a quiet contentment that surprised us both. William taught me to read the weather in the movement of the clouds, to recognize the calls of different birds, to bake bread that did not burn or come out heavy as stone. I learned to mend his shirts, to manage the small household accounts, to tend the kitchen garden that lay dormant beneath the snow but would flourish again come spring. We talked, endlessly it seemed, about everything we had never said before. All the years of silence and separation now poured out in long evenings by the fire. He told me about the loneliness of those early years in exile, the nights when he had wondered if he would ever feel like himself again, the slow process of rebuilding a sense of purpose and dignity from nothing. I told him about the prison of Ashford Hall, the way I had felt myself shrinking year by year, becoming smaller and quieter until I was barely more than a shadow moving through the rooms. And we spoke of Edward, of the brother William had lost, and the man whose deathbed confession had set all of this in motion. William's anger had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something softer, more like sorrow than rage. He grieved for the relationship they might have had, for the years stolen by pride and misunderstanding, for the forgiveness that had come too late. One evening in January, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, I asked him if he regretted that he had never seen Edward again, never had the chance to speak with him face to face, to hear his apology in his own words. William was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, measured. "I do regret it," he said. "Not because I needed to hear him apologize, but because I wish I could have told him that I understood how fear can make us cruel, how the weight of responsibility can twist good intentions into terrible choices. I wish I could have told him that I forgave him, not because what he did was right, but because holding on to hatred was destroying me as surely as it destroyed him." "You have forgiven him," I said gently. "Perhaps not in words spoken to his face, but in your heart. You have let him go. That is what matters." He reached for my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. "And I have forgiven you," he said. "I need you to know that, Eleanor. Truly forgiven you, not just said the words, but meant them. You are not the woman who stood silent 15 years ago. You are the woman who traveled across England to face her guilt, who risked everything to tell the truth, who chose honesty over comfort. That woman deserves forgiveness, and she has it." Tears blurred my vision, and I leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart beneath my cheek. I had carried my guilt for so long that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to be free of it, and now, with his forgiveness wrapping around me like a blanket, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt peace. Spring came slowly to the fells, creeping in on cold winds that still carried the bite of winter, even as the first green shoots pushed through the thawing earth. William and I worked together in the garden, turning the soil, planting seeds, our hands dirty and our backs aching, but our spirits light. The village began to feel like home, the people no longer strangers but neighbors who greeted us warmly when we passed, who stopped to exchange news or to share vegetables from their own gardens. Mrs. Hartley became a frequent visitor, bringing preserves and gossip in equal measure, and sometimes in the evenings the vicar would stop by to discuss theology or philosophy or whatever book he had been reading. Our life was simple, modest, unremarkable to anyone looking from the outside, but to me it was a kind of miracle, a daily reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal, that even the darkest guilt could be transformed into something like grace. In May, as the hawthorn bloomed white along the stone walls and the lambs grew bold in the fields, I realized that I was with child. The knowledge came to me gradually, in the fatigue that settled over me in the afternoons, in the way certain smells made my stomach turn, in the tenderness of my body that was both familiar and strange. I said nothing at first, wanting to be certain, wanting to hold the secret close for just a little while before sharing it with the world. But William noticed, of course. He noticed the way I moved more carefully, the way I pressed my hand to my stomach when I thought he was not looking, the way I had stopped drinking the strong tea I usually preferred. One morning, as we sat at the table breaking our fast, he set down his cup and said very gently, "When were you going to tell me?" I looked up at him, at the quiet joy already dawning in his eyes, and I felt my own eyes fill with tears. "Soon," I said. I wanted to be sure. "Are you pleased?" He came around the table and knelt beside my chair, taking both my hands in his. "Pleased does not begin to describe it," he said. "I thought I had lost everything when I was banished. I thought my life was over in every way that mattered. And now, here I am, with you, with this, with a future I never dared to imagine. How could I be anything but grateful?" The child was born in late autumn, as the leaves turned gold and the first snows dusted the peaks of the fells. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when I was afraid, when the pain seemed too much to bear, and I wondered if I would survive to hold the baby I had carried all these months. But Mrs. Hartley was there, steady and competent, guiding me through each contraction. And William waited just outside the door, his footsteps pacing back and forth, until finally, the baby's cry pierced the air, and Mrs. Hartley called him in. It was a boy, small and red and perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and William's gray eyes. We named him Edward, after the brother who had wronged him and then repented, after the man whose last wish had brought us together. It felt right, that name, a way of honoring the past without being bound by it, a way of acknowledging that even from tragedy and betrayal, new life and new hope could emerge. William held his son with a tenderness that made my heart ache, his large hands cradling the tiny body as if it were made of glass. His eyes wet with tears he did not try to hide. "Thank you," he whispered, and I did not know if he was speaking to me or to some power beyond us both, but it did not matter. The gratitude was real, the joy was real, and that was enough. The years that followed were not without their challenges. Money was often tight, and there were winters when we had to count every penny, when we ate simple meals and wore patched clothing and wondered if we would have enough to see us through until spring. But we had each other, and we had our son, and we had the fierce, stubborn love that had grown between us, and those things made us richer than any fortune could have. Edward grew into a bright, curious boy, quick to laugh and endlessly inquisitive, always asking questions about the world around him, always wanting to know how things worked and why things were the way they were. William taught him to read and write, to recognize the stars and the names of plants, to walk the fells with respect and care. And I told him stories of courage and redemption, of people who made mistakes and found their way back to grace, of love that endured even in the darkest times. We did not speak to him about Ashford Hall, not at first. He was too young to understand, and the past seemed so far away, so distant from the life we had built, that it felt almost like it belonged to different people, characters in a story rather than our own lived experience. But as he grew older, as he began to ask about his name and where his father came from, we knew we would have to tell him the truth. We chose a day in late summer when Edward was 10 years old, when he had the maturity to understand at least some of what we were telling him. We sat together in the garden, the three of us, and William told him the story. He told him about the banishment, about the lie and the injustice, about the years of exile and the brother who had wronged him. And I told him about my part in it, about my silence and my guilt, about the journey I had taken to find William and seek forgiveness. Edward listened with wide eyes, his young face serious and thoughtful, and when we finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a voice that was small but steady, "Does this mean I come from bad people?" William reached out and pulled him close, holding him tight. "No," he said firmly. "You come from people who made mistakes, but who also learned from them. You come from people who chose love and honesty over pride and fear. You come from people who believe that the past did not have to define the future, and that is a good thing to come from. Our son seemed to accept this, and as he grew older, he carried the story with him as part of his own identity, not as a burden, but as a reminder of what was possible when people chose courage over comfort, when they chose to face their sins and seek redemption. William and I grew old together in that cottage on the fell, our hair turning white, our bodies slowing, but our love deepening with each passing year. We never returned to Ashford Hall, never sought to reclaim any part of the life that had been lost. That world no longer existed for us, and we had no desire to resurrect it. We had found something better, something truer, and we held on to it with both hands. On the morning of my 70th birthday, I woke to find William already awake beside me, his hand resting lightly on mine, his eyes watching me with the same quiet intensity they had held on the day I first arrived at his gate. "Good morning," he said, and his voice was rough with age, but warm with affection. "Good morning," I replied, and I smiled at him, at this man who had taught me what forgiveness truly meant, who had shown me that even the deepest guilt could be transformed into grace. We rose and dressed, moving slowly, our joints stiff with the cold that was always worse in the mornings now. We made tea and sat together at the table, looking out the window at the fells we had walked together for nearly 30 years, at the world that had become our home. "Do you have any regrets?" William asked me, and there was no judgment in the question, only genuine curiosity. I thought about it, about all the years that had passed, all the choices I had made, good and bad, all the pain and the joy and the long, slow process of learning to forgive myself. And then I said, honestly, only one. I regret that I did not speak the truth sooner, that I let you suffer alone for so long. But I do not regret coming here, and I do not regret any day I have spent with you. This life we have built, it is not the life I expected, but it is the life I was meant to have. He reached across the table and took my hand, his fingers gnarled now, but still strong, still capable of holding on. "And I do not regret any of it," he said. "Not the banishment, not the hardship, not the years alone. Because all of it led me here, to you, to this, and I would not trade this for anything." We sat there together as the sun rose over the fells, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and I thought about the Duke who had banished his brother over a lie, who had died wishing for forgiveness he never received in person, but had granted in spirit. I thought about the choices we all make, the ways we hurt each other, and the ways we heal, the long, difficult journey from guilt to grace. And I knew, as I sat there with William's hand in mine, that we had both been forgiven, by each other, and perhaps by something larger than ourselves. We had both found our way home, not to a place, but to each other, and that was more than enough. That was everything.